In recent weeks, the evolving situation around Belarus and Russia has taken a number of striking turns. The United States has signaled a modest easing of sanctions on Belarus. Long queues have formed at border points, and fresh deployments of defense weapons and military assets have been observed, all of which combine to create a complex geopolitical tableau with implications for Europe, the wider post-Soviet region, and transatlantic relations. On the sanctions front, Washington's decision to soften certain restrictions is widely interpreted as part of a broader recalibration of its approach to Minsk. Rather than purely isolating the Belarusian regime, the US seems to be experimenting with selective engagement in the hope of reopening channels of influence, curbing hybrid threats, and reducing Belarus's full dependence on Russia. Analysts note that this move might reflect a recognition that Belarus under Alexander Lukashenko could play a broker or buffer role, and that rigid isolation has had limited success. Meanwhile, at the Belarus-Russia land border, reports of long queues of vehicles, increased border control checks, and heightened administrative hurdles have emerged. These may reflect the heightened security posture of Belarusian and Russian authorities as they respond to logistical flows, migration pressures, and the transit of goods and equipment. The visible backlog of trucks and cars is symptomatic of the friction generated by the simultaneous pressures of militarization, economic stress, and border management escalation. In parallel, there is clear evidence of fresh deployments of defense weapons and military hardware in Belarusian territory. Russia has moved assets into Belarus, announced joint drills, and hinted at deeper integration. In effect, Belarus is becoming a forward base for Russian strategic interests. The deployment of heavy equipment, missile systems, and increased troop presence signals to both NATO and the European Union that Minsk's role is shifting, no longer merely a passive ally of Moscow, but an active platform for projection of force in the region. This triangular dynamic, US sanction relaxation, border queue escalation, and armament deployment, thus creates a layered challenge. For the US, easing sanctions offers a chance to reset relations, but risks being perceived in Europe as rewarding a regime that remains authoritarian and aligned with Russia. For Belarus, the queues and border delays underscore the domestic cost of deepening military commitments, while the armament influx deepens Minsk's strategic tether to Moscow. For Russia, embedding weapons and infrastructure in Belarus offers strategic depth against the West, but requires sustaining Belarus economically and politically in the face of Western pressure. In the broader picture, this signals a shift in the security architecture of Eastern Europe. The frontier region around Belarus is becoming not merely a theater of diplomatic chess, but a zone of kinetic posture and logistical bottleneck. Ukraine's war, the NATO eastern flank, migration flows, energy transit routes, and economic sanctions all converge in this nexus, making the Belarus-Russia border a flashpoint of competing strategic logics. The border queues hint at the tangible consequences for civilian and commercial traffic of rising militarization and tighter controls, while the sanction shift by the US underscores that diplomatic tools are being recalibrated in real time. At the same time, weapons deployments reinforce that diplomacy cannot alone contain the strategic game. Hard power elements are clearly in motion. The result is a hybrid mix of coercion, diplomacy, and economic inducement, played out in one geographic corridor. Observers caution that the risk of miscalculation is elevated when weapons are placed closer to alliance territory and border friction increases. The chances of unintended escalation grow. Moreover, the US easing of sanctions may be read by Moscow and Minsk as a signal of Western fatigue or strategic rebalancing, potentially encouraging further Russian demands or provocations. The film of thousands of cars and trucks idling at border posts captures not just delays but the tangible geography of geopolitical contestation. Each stalled vehicle, each inspection line, each diversion to alternate crossings tells a story of how security policy, trade flows and military strategy intersect. Meanwhile, Belarus's increasing exposure to Russian military logistics and presence could, over time, reduce its sovereignty, deepen domestic economic strain, and provoke greater unrest, though the regime appears determined to ride this path as it pursues its own survival. In sum, the confluence of US sanction flexibility, border queue build-up and defense weapon deployment underscores that the Belarus-Russia axis is entering a new phase, one where containment gives way to selective engagement, where border infrastructure becomes a strategic asset, and where military positioning is increasingly entwined with economic and diplomatic strategy. Whether this new phase brings stability, deterrence, or renewed escalation remains uncertain, but what is clear is that the region is now under a far sharper spotlight, and that the decisions made by Washington, Minsk, and Moscow will reverberate across Europe, the Atlantic Alliance, and beyond.